Going on the webinar. So, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this special presentation, the Malware Incident Response, what I call the CliffsNotes version. And we literally have people from all over the country, all over the world on this. So whatever time of day it is for you, thank you for being here. And I see some familiar faces and names, and some that I have not seen before, or that may not know me or much about me. So I'll just start off with a very brief introduction. If we haven't met before, if you haven't seen me face to face, I'm an old guy. That's what I look like. And I've been in the business forever. I just celebrated my 54th year since I started as a programmer trainee back in 1966. And yes, if you're doing the math, that was 15 years before IBM announced their personal computer and before anybody had ever heard of Microsoft or MS-DOS. So not going to go into a whole lot of background information. Point is, I've got a lot of scars. Pretty much anything that has happened in the PC industry, I was either part of it or was at least around watching it. And that includes starting a specialty in malware back in 2002. That's when I took on the name The Virus Doctor. And back then, everything was viruses. Today, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that, and the term malware has replaced what we used to call viruses. But again, more detail than we probably need to go into. A lot of what I've been doing over the last 20 years has been training, mostly techs. And there again, it's been all over the world, in person and online. And so far, I have graduates in 48 states and 2 U.S. territories and 8 foreign countries. So I'm still trying to fill those last couple of pins on the map in the U.S., but we're getting there. I am based in Houston, Texas. That's where I'm coming to you from today. And it's a nice day here today. To make our lives easier, mine and yours both, have a great helper, Roger Whitaker. Roger is what I call the man behind the curtain. Roger, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ken. Pleasure to be here today.
Well, as you can tell from that announcer voice, Roger is a trained professional, and he lives in Kentucky. He owns a break fix shop in Owensboro, and he's actually completed the full what used to be called the Virus Remediation Training Workshop, now called the Malware Incident Response Training Workshop, twice. So he's a level 2 certified malware removal specialist. So one of the things that Roger will be doing for you and for me is he's in the background monitoring your questions and taking care of any that come up, that pretty much anything that doesn't require a direct response from me. Again, Roger is a very highly qualified tech and very good at understanding questions and multitasking. And so he'll respond to a lot of those directly. The ones that require a response from me will hold until the prepared part of the remarks are done, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can. I am going to try to hold the prepared discussion to a half hour and leave another half hour for Q&A. With all the attendees we have, that may or may not be enough to get around to all of them. You may have noticed that there's a handout available to you from the link on your dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to go ahead and download that and print it out. It has a lot of useful links in it and good references. A lot of what I'll be doing is talking about specific products or procedures, and so the handout has the links to download those or to get more details. So first of all, just kind of the big picture of where we're coming from and going with this. Most of you know I have a workshop that again was called the Virus Remediation Training Workshop, and this year I rebranded it the Malware Incident Response Training Workshop. First put it together almost 11 years ago, and it has evolved a lot over the years. And it's a 2-day workshop with over 16 hours of content and 150 pages of printed materials plus a CD-ROM. And so a friend of mine challenged me not long ago to come up with the most important parts of that workshop that I could pass along to other techs to make them better prepared for what we're dealing with these days and pretty much every day. So what you're going to get in the next half hour is what I consider to be the most important 30 minutes out of this 16 plus hours of content. And so again, it's going to go by fast, but it'll give you information you need to respond to the next malware incident you deal with. What you won't be getting is the context that usually comes with the full workshop and some of the background information and some of the details. But again, the handout will include and does include links to get some of those additional details as necessary. With a lot of references I think you'll find useful. As a starting point, I'm going to talk about the 4 stages of malware removal. Anytime that there's a malware issue or you suspect there's a malware issue on a client's machine or network, The first step is the basic detection. Make that determination, is there malware or not? Is it a hardware, software, malware, whatever? So detection is the first step. Then once you've determined that there is, you need to identify it. Not necessarily down to the finest level, but in the four major categories that I'll be talking about on the next slide. At that point, it's time to neutralize it. Stop the damage, whatever it's doing, keep it from doing any more of it. And finally, remove it and do whatever cleanup is necessary for that particular episode of malware. The four categories of malware I've referred to are, first of all, encrypting ransomware. And the most widespread, the first widespread ransomware wasn't CryptoLocker. It wasn't encrypting ransomware. It was a different form of ransomware that's pretty much mostly gone away these days. So encrypting ransomware, I can pretty much shorten that to ransomware in general these days, and it will be accurate with what you're likely to be dealing with. Then we have what's known as rogues, rogue software, also known as potentially unwanted programs, or PUPs. And frankly, the term PUP, I think, was invented by the anti-malware companies to reduce their number of lawsuits from companies saying, well, you called our stuff malware, and it's really not. The user wanted it. They checked the box that said they wanted it. Yeah, we know. But anyway, they're a separate category we'll talk about. Then there's the traditional malware, the viruses, worms, Trojan horses, and things that lead into backdoors and keyloggers and botnets and other payloads that we'll be talking about. And finally, rootkits. Rootkits, as you know, are deeply embedded in the operating system itself. And so those are a separate category, now including what's known as the fileless malware, which is a little bit of a misnomer because there's really no such thing as completely fileless, but that's beyond what we need to talk about for here. They don't really officially fit into the rootkit category, but that's, out of these four categories, it's the one that's most appropriate. So with that as a starting point, what I'm going to get into is the methodology that I recommend and that I teach in the full workshop to deal with each one of these four categories, and you deal with them in that specific sequence. Now, I'm not claiming this is the only way to do it, but it's a methodology I first developed over 10 years ago. It has served me and a lot of techs very well over the years. And again, it's been continuously updated for all the new threats that are out there, the new infection vectors, the new types of malware, the new payloads, the new evasion techniques, all of that. So as you know, it's a moving target that keeps changing continuously. So as of today, there are literally hundreds of techs all around the world that are using this methodology and the things you'll be seeing in the next half hour here to deal with any of these types of malware. In some cases, there are some proprietary tools that can speed up the process. But I want to emphasize that the workshop and procedure I'm going to teach you here today is not about running a bunch of scans looking for malware. That's a losing game, and yes, it'll catch some, but there are a lot that it will miss, and a lot of duplicated effort and a lot of time. So when I talk about tools, we'll talk about a few specific ones. But again, this is not about running a bunch of scans to find and supposedly get rid of malware that may be infecting the machine. Here is a flow chart, and actually I have Roger to thank for taking my thoughts and putting it into this nice, neat form here. But it really illustrates the overall procedure we'll be talking about. And if you're not familiar with flow charting in the programming sense, the diamond-shaped boxes indicate a decision. And so there are four of those diamond boxes that correspond to the four categories we talked about. First of all, is there any ransomware? And if so, deal with it. Then any PUPs or rogues, and same thing, deal with it there. Now, those first two categories, if the machine has them, it'll be obvious. It's not going to be something you have to wonder whether you have encrypting ransomware or PUPs or rogues. They're going to be very obvious, and they'll show themselves. That's part of how they get paid or how they intend to get paid. So the identification part is pretty easy for those. Then you get down to the number one, and I talk about a suspicious process. That's where we start dealing with traditional malware. And there could be multiple processes running that are actually malicious or at least suspicious. And so that's where the biggest percentage of the boxes on the flow chart happen. But overall, it is the third category. And then when you get through with all of those, you come down to the number two here, and that's kind of the final step to check for rootkits or bootkits and deal with them. So that's the overall procedure in a nutshell. As you see, it all fits on one slide, one page of paper. So the concept is not real involved. The implementation, yes, it does get into a few more issues than that. So the one you're most likely to deal with and the one you have to deal with first these days is encrypting ransomware. So when I say you have to deal with it first, it's going to be the most critical one and also the one with the potentially the most far-reaching implications for your client or user. And again, if you have ransomware, you're not going to have to figure it out. It will tell you. You'll see the ransom notes, you'll see the inability to open data files, that sort of thing. And so you will know when there is ransomware. When you're dealing with ransomware, there are two separate issues to deal with. The first is removing the infection itself. That's easy. Pretty much any anti-malware program will find and remove the encryption process. But the harder part is restoring the encrypted data files. And there are a lot of potential considerations there that will vary depending on exactly what you're dealing with. So we'll spend a little bit more time on that shortly. Now, just in case you, by any chance, don't know what we're talking about, this is a screenshot from the original CryptoLocker that hit almost 7 years ago, September of 2013. And that's what's known as the ransom note. It basically tells the user what's happened and what it's going to take to get past it. Now, also, you'll notice that one of the things that has changed over the years is the cost of ransomware. In the first generation CryptoLocker, it cost $100 to get the decryption key. Well, as you know, it's well into the thousands or tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, millions of dollars in ransom demand these days. So it's a huge problem and a very expensive problem. But that's a key part of every ransomware infection is the ransom note. So that tells the user and in turn you and me what you need to know to help figure out how to deal with it. Now, out of all the slides in this presentation, this is what I would consider to be the most important one of all, and that is what not to do. Because almost every tech out there that has not been through this training or something similar is going to make some what I call fatal mistakes. So here's what not to do. First of all, do not ever start off by scanning the system for malware. Once you do, you may have lost any hope of restoring those data files. So do not do that. No matter how much you like or trust your particular anti-malware program or how much a part of your habit pattern that is, do not do that yet. Also, don't do anything to remove the malware or the ransom notes until you've identified the exact family and strain of ransomware. There are thousands of different families and strains of ransomware out there. And to deal with it effectively, you must know exactly which one you're dealing with. And on the following slides, we'll get into more details about that. And a third big mistake that most techs will make is wipe and reload the system. That's not going to get your data back. Yes, it'll get rid of the infection, but there are a lot of other ways to do that, much less destructive with much fewer long-term implications. So no point in doing that. And by the same token, there's no need to replace any hardware, unless it was time to replace it anyway, just because it's getting to that age or it was Windows 7 or something older. But as far as replacing hardware as a solution for ransomware, there again, that's not going to get your data back. So here's some of the things to do. Again, determine the family and strain of ransomware. And again, we'll get into that in more detail in just a minute. The next thing, critical in the early stage, is to figure out what backups you have and whether they're still available to you and still good. One of the first things that ransomware will typically do is everything they can to keep you from being able to get to any backup copies. They'll start off by deleting the volume shadow copies and any data files. The backup files themselves will frequently get encrypted if not deleted. And so at this point, what you need to do, if you think you have good backups, is test it. Take a sample of your backups and restore some of those files and folders to another computer altogether. Make sure A, they're still there, B, they have not been corrupted, and C, you can successfully restore them. That's especially important if you're dealing with things like SQL databases, where there may be multiple files that are involved in putting together what the user sees. So you need to be sure that those backups are good. Unfortunately, a lot of people discover at this point that either the backups haven't actually been made, or they've been deleted or encrypted or something that's going to be an unpleasant surprise to you. The next thing you need to do right off is to identify what's known as patient zero, the actual computer that was the carrier of that infection, which will not necessarily be the same one that the encrypted data files show up on. Especially in a networked environment, hopefully all of those encrypted data files are going to be on the server. But in many cases, the server itself is not infected. One of the workstations was infected, and the files it has access to are on the server. So the symptoms show up on the server, but that's not where the actual infection is. So just identifying that patient 0 is not always an easy or straightforward process, and again, beyond the scope of what we can cover in this brief period today. But depending on what your environment is, what kind of other tools you have available to you, there are ways to identify that patient 0 and disconnect it from the network to keep any further encryption from happening. Next, you need to figure out whether that encryptor is still active. And generally speaking, ransomware falls into one of two categories. In a lot of cases, especially the earlier ones, once the encryption was done, then the encryptor itself was deleted. And so if you scanned and looked for the encryption process, it wasn't there. It had done its damage and it went away. These days, that's not necessarily the case. Even after all the encryption has been done, it may still be active. So what you don't want to do is restore your data files and have them immediately re-encrypted. So there's a quick and easy way of getting a pretty good read on whether that's the case or not using Process Explorer with the VirusTotal option, which I'll show you on the next slide. And in fact, let me just go ahead and go to that right now. I know most of you are familiar with Process Explorer, especially those of you that have been through the virus remediation training or malware incident response training workshop. It's been around for a long time. It's been continually improved. In fact, the current version was just updated in December of last year. So it is still being updated. A relatively recent addition to Process Explorer is this column out here on the right called VirusTotal. Again, most of you are familiar with VirusTotal, but what Process Explorer has done has been to integrate that into the program. You have to customize Process Explorer to be able to show this column, but there again, you can find that on the web or in the description of Process Explorer itself. But what I'm recommending you do as a quick and dirty way of seeing if you have any active encryptors is to run Process Explorer and then sort by the VirusTotal column so that the highest number shows up first. As a general rule, VirusTotal is using some number of anti-malware engines. At the time of this screenshot, which was this week, there were 73 different engines that it submits that particular sample to. And so this tells you how many of those indicated it was malware. In the case of actual malware, especially if it's been around for more than a day or two, that number, the first number shown there will be at least 10 or 12 or 15 or 20 or maybe even more. If you have 1, 2, or 3, that's probably a false positive. And those are most common on things like anti-malware products or RMM type tools, or in this case, my Instant House Call, which is the program I use for accessing clients' machines remotely. So if it's less than, say, 2 or 3 that shows up in the first column there, or the first number, then it's probably a false positive. And if that's all you see, then it's a pretty safe bet that in fact, there is no active malware running. I say pretty safe, it's not 100%. I have seen cases where there have been some that have not been detected by any of the VirusTotal or by just 1 or 2. But that's a pretty good, easy read on it. The next thing you can do is look for any suspicious connections to the internet. And there's a combination of 3 tools you use to do that. For the command prompt, use the netstat command with a -no, which will show you all the active internet connections, the IP addresses, and the process ID in the task manager. So then you go to task manager, look at that process ID and see what program is actually responsible for that connection. And I use aaron.net to identify the owner of that IP address there again to figure out whether it's malicious or a legitimate site that you have good reason to be connected to. The next thing you want to do is look for signs of persistence. In other words, persistence is a common technique that a lot of the more sophisticated malware will use so that even if you kill it, it will come back in one form or another. And in most cases of persistent malware, whether it's ransomware or traditional malware, it's going to be in registry somewhere. It could be in task schedule. The majority of them are in some registry keys. And again, the total scope of those is way beyond what we can cover here. There are hundreds of registry keys that could be used for persistence. So when you're dealing with ransomware, what you need to get to is a better understanding of what your most likely outcome is. There are 3 possibilities. One is you might be able to decrypt those data files without paying the ransom. There are some free decryptors out there, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in just a minute. The files may be decryptable after the ransom is paid. Overall, the producers of ransomware have pretty good customer service, much better than a lot of the vendors that we trust and deal with on a regular basis. A lot of them feel like it is in their best interest to help anybody that pays the ransom to get their data files back. Because if the word got out that no, you're not going to get your data files back even after you paid the ransom, nobody would do it. So point is, there's a very good chance that if you pay the ransom, you will get the data back. But you need to kind of narrow that down before you make the decision. Unfortunately, there's a third possibility, and that is that the files may not be decryptable at all, even after you paid the ransom. And there are two reasons for that. One is that a lot of the people that are producing or distributing ransomware are really not very good programmers. They're using somebody else's code with their modifications. They might not thoroughly understand how encryption and decryption works. And so they may not mean to be permanently losing your data files for you, but that could be the end result. And in some cases, there are others that just never have any intention of giving you your data files back. They're just going to take the money and run. But the point is, you need to know which one of those outcomes is most likely in your particular situation. And to do that, you need to identify the ransomware. There are a lot of ways you could do that. We don't need to go through all of these because there are a couple of ways that you can get to it more quickly and easily. A couple of websites that'll help you with that identification. And these are in your handout. You can click directly on those and go to them. ID Ransomware. That one lets you upload a ransom note and a sample encrypted file. And then based on that, it will tell you what family and strain of ransomware that is. And it's not always exact. It may say it could be this one or this one or this one. But point is, it'll narrow it down a lot for you and let you know what the likelihood is of A, getting a free decryptor for it, or B, getting decrypted once the ransom is paid. Another similar site with broader support, this started off with 4 vendors in Europe, nomoreransom.org. And now they have about 90 cooperating vendors and other people that have helped contribute to it. So they operate similarly. With No More Ransom, it's a little bit different. They need you to upload 2 encrypted files, and you don't necessarily have to upload the actual ransom note if you can just remember some of the contents. So the point is, the ransom note and the encrypted files are what's required to make this determination. And that gets back to what I was saying about the biggest mistake. If you automatically start off by removing the ransomware and the ransom notes, then you're not going to be able to do that identification. Another very useful resource that, again, I know most of you are already using is Bleeping Computer. That's a great first stop for seeing anything that, for whatever reason, ID Ransomware or No More Ransom can't identify. And they keep it very up to date. Larry Abrams is a very savvy techie and very dedicated to doing what he can to fight ransomware. So between those sites, you can get a pretty good idea of what your options are. But again, the possible options, you may be able to get a free decryptor, you may be able to pay for it, or it may not be decryptable. So if you have good backups, then it's time to go ahead and remove the active malware. And really, the malware itself is pretty easy to remove. You can use the anti-malware tool of your choice. The one that I recommend is the Malwarebytes toolset. Now, this is not going to be a product plug for any particular products. Malwarebytes is not paying me to pitch their product, but I have a great working relationship with them and a very high regard for their product. I'm not talking about the free anti-malware scanner that anybody can download from Malwarebytes. I'm talking about the paid professional tool that has a lot of additional functionality, capabilities, and much faster. So it's a Malwarebytes tool set. And again, there's a link in your handout to give you more information about that. Once you've gotten rid of the active processes, any active malware process, then go ahead and restore your most critical files or folders from backups and restore them to their live locations and see what happens. My suggestion is to wait 24 hours just to make sure that there really wasn't an active encryptor that somehow got missed. The reality is that in most cases, if there is, it's probably not going to have much of a dwell time. It's not going to wait very long to look for any new files that need to get encrypted. So if you really need to get back to getting things back to normal as quickly as possible, if you wait an hour, that should be long enough to figure out whether in fact there is still an active encryptor. But again, there probably won't be. We're just talking about being super safe here. At that point, I would encourage you to scan all the computers on the network and looking for any type of malware, whether it's ransomware or anything else. And don't be surprised if you find malware on some or all of them. Encrypting ransomware isn't the only kind of threat out there. And there's a lot of undetected malware on a lot of machines today. So if that's a good excuse to go ahead and scan for all of them, have at it. And be sure you enable multi-factor authentication everywhere you can and change all the passwords. So if you don't have good backups, now there's one bullet point that probably should be on here, but I wasn't sure whether to put it first or last or somewhere in between, but that is to pray, because that may be the only option you have left. But realistically, you want to hope for a free decryptor. And there again, if there is one, then one of those sites that you've gone to make the determination will tell you. But just bear in mind, they have a short shelf life. Pretty soon after a free decryptor is released, then the bad guys see it also. They figure out what they did wrong. They update their ransomware so that free decryptor doesn't work anymore. There again, your handout has a list of 8 different vendors that are producing free decryptors. And most of the reputable anti-malware companies are definitely working on this every day, looking for any way they can defeat or get around any of the encryption out there. The next thing you need to figure out is, do you have the money, or does the client have the money available to pay the ransom? Is it an outrageous amount that there's no question that you can't do it? If it's a multi-million-dollar ransom demand and your annual sales are $100,000, clearly that's not going to work. And if you have, or if the client has the resources, do they have it in the form of the cryptocurrency? Because just getting a cryptocurrency wallet set up and getting the Bitcoin or Monero or whatever may be required could take a few days, and that could also be expensive. Bear in mind, the amount may be negotiable. There are some intermediaries out there that can negotiate a good deal or a better deal. I don't recommend them. They are working hand in hand with the criminals, but if it can get the money down and also have added assurance that you will get the data back, then you might want to consider it. But the other thing you need to consider is the cost of recreating data. And overall, some figures have been run that indicate that the average ransomware demand is about 40 to 50 times less than the cost of recreating the data. And in a lot of cases, the data can't be recreated. So from a dollars and cents standpoint, frequently it does make sense to pay the ransom. That is not a blanket recommendation that you should always pay the ransom. But I'm saying that from a practical standpoint, you need to consider whether that is in the organization's best interest. Because frankly, a lot of companies that haven't paid the ransom have gone out of business. And I say organization here and not company, because it happens to nonprofits, to government entities, and they literally can't survive without that data. So it's a tough decision, but paying the ransom may be the best choice. Now, we're already close to our half-hour mark, so I'll tell you these other categories don't take as much time as the ransomware. But the rogues and pups go especially quickly because, again, they're obvious. You'll see a pop-up, a suggestion or request. The whole idea is to get the user to trick the user into buying unnecessary software, whether it's a fake anti-malware or claim that your hardware is failing and click here to fix it quickly. Anything that claims to speed up the computer, system optimizer, internet accelerators, that sort of thing. That's what I'm talking about in terms of rogues or pups. And they're really not as malicious as the other forms of malware, but they are annoying and represent some cost to the user. And also they may have other malware that come along with them. At the same time, a lot of them will block some of the normal tools that you and I would use to get rid of them, like Task Manager and regedit. So just be aware of those roadblocks. Now here's an example of what I'm talking about. It's a really oldie but goodie. Notice Smart Fortress 2012. So that tells you how old it is. But the point is, this is still pretty typical of what these look like. It's got the general structure of a normal window and the pretty colors and the progress bar and things that look like what you'd expect to see or what the user would expect to see. So that's what we're talking about with rogues or pups. The good news is they're pretty easy to get rid of. Especially over the last couple of years, they've gotten relatively better behaved. In most cases, you can go to Add Remove Programs and Control Panel and uninstall each one of them. That wasn't always the case. up until a couple of years ago, that could be a wild goose chase that never did actually get rid of them. These days, they mostly do. Also, when you're in add remove programs, you can sort by install date. You may see a cluster of them, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 that were all installed at the same time, that are all in those categories that I talked about. Also, if by any chance they don't show up there, or if you choose not to remove them that way, Malwarebytes toolset, and frankly, most of the other anti-malware programs are pretty good these days about finding and removing those. And system restore may be an effective option if it's enabled and if you have a restore point that's fairly recent. But again, be prepared for the roadblocks that the rogues may throw up in terms of blocking Task Manager, Regedit, or some of the other system tools that you might intend to use. Traditional malware, the biggest problem with it is the fact that most of the more sophisticated traditional malware doesn't show any obvious symptoms of infection. So you need to make that determination, is this an issue of malware? Also, some of them use what's known as a buddy system, which means if you find and kill the malware, it will come back based on that other buddy process that's watching what you're doing. Again, they range from pretty simplistic all the way back to the techniques that were used in the 90s to some of the very latest. They can be very involved, very sophisticated. Also, the payload is what you're really concerned about, not so much the category, but the payload is what they're there to do, whether it's exfiltrating or stealing data, setting a backdoor, keylogger, joining that computer in a botnet, replicating, spreading, whatever. So the payload is what you're concerned about, but the malware is what's doing it. And so here again, what you want to do is use Process Explorer to identify the actual malicious processes. And for a lot of this, you could also use Task Manager, but Process Explorer gives you some additional functionality. I'm going to hit a few more features of Process Explorer in here just to call your attention to what you're looking for. The verified signer here lets you know who this software came from, and if in fact it does match the certificate that's on file for them. Auto start location is where it started, whether it's in the registry or Task Manager or started up, Task Scheduler or started manually. You can go across here and compare the executable to the description, the auto start location, and the vendor, and make sure all of those match. Those are the type of things that you're looking for. But again, if you start off by looking for the ones that VirusTotal identifies as being more than just a few, showing that it's malicious, then that's a good start. So once you identify that malicious process, then kill it. Figure out where it came from, and there again, that column in Process Explorer will show you where it came from, and you need to remove that from the registry or restore the infected registry entry itself. If there were infected programs that were doing the damage, clean or infect those, and then block the ability to reinstall the malware. That's something you don't always have to do, depending on where it's happening. If it's a run key, yes, you probably want to change the permission to keep that from being able to happen again. But in most cases, that won't be necessary. And then go back and look for the next one. So lather, rinse, repeat. In the case of traditional malware, there's rarely just one process you need to deal with, and especially when you're still identifying suspicious rather than known malicious ones, you may have 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, or 10, or even more. So again, that can be the most time-consuming part of the procedure, but there are some tools that'll help automate some of that. That brings us to the final category, which is rootkits, which fall into several different subcategories as far as what kind of infection. The general idea is they're buried within the operating system itself, whether it's the boot sector of the hard drive and or the master boot record, legitimate Windows processes, .sys files. This is a relatively new technique that started with what they used, what was known as a TDL3 type of rootkit, which has evolved into TDL4. And I mentioned the latest twist on this which is fileless malware. Again, that's a little bit of a misnomer because at one point there is a file that actually injects that code into the registry and then the file gets deleted. So the point is there's no file left behind to be found in a scan. But at that point, it's actually become, for all practical purposes, part of the operating system. So that's why I put it in the category of a rootkit. So as far as rootkit removal, most of this is done by things that you and I don't have direct access to. And so it does involve using tools to detect and remove them. And once again, I would start off with the Malwarebytes tool set. That tool set does include rootkit detection, but by default it is disabled. But even with rootkit disabled, rootkit detection disabled, it will still find about 90% of the rootkits, depending on their behavior. So if you know or have a strong suspicion there's a rootkit, but the default Malwarebytes toolset doesn't find it, then enable rootkit detection and run the scan again. It will take 2 or 3 times as long to run, which is why they don't have it enabled by default. But even so, you're still talking about just a few minutes. It's a relatively very fast and very accurate scan. If it doesn't find anything, but you're still convinced that there is a rootkit, the next one I would run is TDSS Killer from Kaspersky. And again, you have the links to download these programs in your handout. And if that still doesn't find anything or can't get rid of it, a program that most people have never heard of probably will. That's called Gmer. And again, the download information in your handout. If you still think you have a rootkit, I would question that determination. I have not yet found a rootkit that would get past all of these steps. So with that, just a quick review dealing with encrypting ransomware, rogue software, traditional malware, and then rootkits. That is the whole methodology. And once you've done this a few times, you can go through that whole process usually in less than an hour. Now, depending on the ransomware, if there was some, then the recovery and getting the data files, that changes the timing a lot. But in terms of the malware itself, that's what we're talking about. So that's the more or less half-hour version of the 16 hours of content. But if you want to get into that in more detail, again, the full workshop is 2 days. It's 2 half days, actually. There's 8 hours of live hands-on workshop, plus about another 8 hours, actually a lot more than that, but mainly about 8 or 10 hours of additional recorded information. And this falls into 3 general categories: education, tools, and the methodology. You've seen the methodology, some of the education, and we talked about some of the tools. So I had been doing it in person or online. Of course, these days, the in-person workshops have been temporarily suspended, but I'll get back to those once they're allowed. But in the meantime, we're doing lots of online workshops, and I schedule public workshops several times per month at different times of day to accommodate different time zones and people in different countries that want to take these. If you have enough people that you'd like to have trained, we can certainly talk about a private workshop for your people and your schedule. And again, I'll be doing in person once we are allowed to and can travel. So there's my email address if you want to talk about the schedule and pricing for private workshops. Now, the tuition, and this has been true for all 11 years, it's $4.95 per attendee. But these days, I know that all of us are going through reduced cash flow, and I want to do my part to help make this more easily accessible, especially as you may have some downtime now, which can be a good time for sharpening the saw, improving your skill set while you're waiting for the phone to ring or for other billable work to come through. So for any workshops, anybody that is on this webinar or the replay of it, if you sign up for a workshop in April or May of this year, I'm offering a 25% discount, which brings it down to $371.25. It does include 12 months of membership in what I call the Continuing Malware Education Program. I mentioned this material is continually updated, and so you are entitled to that for a year, including a monthly 1-hour webinar that all of the graduates that have attended those just rave about. Also, any graduate is recognized as a Certified Malware Removal Specialist, or CMRS, which is what Roger is, and that does include a nice certificate suitable for framing if you're in the US. Internationally, we'll send you the PDF. You're welcome to print it out, frame it, put it on your wall. Also, a beautiful seal that shows you are a CMRS, and you are entitled to put that on your website or any marketing materials. So even if the full sticker price, the return on that investment is just almost impossible not to justify. And so I've had a lot of people tell me they've paid for the course in days or even hours in some cases. So that's the extent of the sales pitch. So there's the link to get more details, to register for a workshop if you like. And to get that discount, you will need to use a coupon code of Corona. And again, that will give you the 25% discount for however many people you sign up using that URL on the website. And once again, you're welcome to contact me directly for any further details at my email address or call me on the phone. So yes, I ran a little bit over the target 30 minutes, but we still have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. So Roger, I suspect we have some of those. Would I be correct?
We sure do, Ken. And of course, great information as always. And if you have a question for Ken, please post your question and he'll be glad to answer them. First question, Ken. I know that several may ask this. Pete asks, may um, uh, will the slide deck be available at some point?
It is not now. The replay will be available shortly, and I can certainly make the slide deck available. In fact, I'll commit to that. I will upload that so that when I send out the replay link, I will also include the link to replay or to download the slide deck. Great question.
Okay, perfect. Oh, perfect. Next question is from Joe. May I add using autoruns.exe as part of the cleaning process? And so more specifically, autoruns loads all the files that run on the system and has a verify also. It has helped me many a time. And so what's your thoughts about that, Ken?
I like auto runs. It's actually one of the tools that I talk about in the full workshop. The downside of auto runs is, as you know, there are thousands of places it will take you, for potential places that things could be starting up. So there's some things you can do with auto runs to make it a little bit less overwhelming. It's a great tool. It's from SysInternals, which is Mark Rosinovich, the same author of Process Explorer. So I'm a big fan, and yes, it's a great tool. Just try not to get overwhelmed by it.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken. Another question from Joe. Why would you be convinced that you have a rootkit?
There are actually several symptoms that I get into in the full workshop that are typically associated with rootkit behavior. And actually, I'll follow up with a direct response to that. But the short answer is that there are signs that you have a rootkit that I've come to recognize over the years.
All right, perfect. Of course, I've got some people that are saying appreciate the slide deck, so that's a good thing. And I have a question about Windows Defender in considering system security. Any general thoughts on that?
The general thought is any free anti-malware is worth what you pay for it. Having said that, Windows Defender or Microsoft Defender or all the different names Microsoft has had for their anti-malware efforts have gotten much better over the years. But as you know, there's no 100% solution with any anti-malware product. And so it does require layered defense and protection. The workshop itself is more about remediation and cleanup and dealing with the after effects, but along the way it does get into a lot of things that relate to that stack overall of different layers of protection, but again, beyond the scope of what we can cover today.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Ken. Got some great comments. You're still the doctor, so that's that's awesome to hear. And looking forward to training. Somebody's saying they're looking forward to that. And where do we get the handout? Do you want to take that, Ken?
Well, two places. For one, in your dashboard from GoToWebinar on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be an area that says attachments or handouts or something like that, and it should have the name of the handout, and just click there to download it. If by any chance you don't see that or it doesn't work or anything like that, I believe Roger has posted in the chat box the actual URL to download the handout. Have you done that, Roger? Is that somewhere you can?
I have not, but I will do that now. And so while I'm doing that, I think you have already really answered this question in your layered thoughts a few moments ago. But with all the people working from home on PC and Mac, what's the best way to protect them?
Yeah, layered defense.
Yeah, layered defense.
There's so many things, and unfortunately, that's one of the side effects of this whole shelter in place and work from home type environment. A lot of people are using their home computers, which are inherently much less secure than what they might have had or do have back at the office. And so in a lot of cases, especially if there's a domain environment you're normally connected to, but the computer at home is on a home version of Windows and it can't connect to the domain. And so a lot of those built-in protections aren't there. Also, they're more likely to be running a free anti-malware product or to be infected with malware and other things that just the whole risk surface is much broader now than it was a month or so ago. And again, there's some additional tools. In fact, here again, I'm not being paid to promote these vendors, but for a work at home situation, a common method is also a very common infection vector, which is RDP, the remote desktop protocol that Microsoft has provided in basically every version of Windows. And especially over the last couple of years, the bad guys have really jumped all over that, and it has become one of the most common infection vectors. There's a vendor that I'm really impressed by that has a great product to address that. The vendor is called TrueGrid. They have a product called Secure RDP. And there's one particular individual I won't name, but whose opinion I value very highly, who is naturally skeptical. And he has come around to believing that Secure RDP and the TrueGrid approach is the best way to handle that type of remote connection. So that link is not in your handout, but again, it's TRU Grid, and they're pretty easy to find on the web. Another product that I like that also adds some additional layer of protection is an alternative DNS server. Of course, most people, especially at home, are using the DNS provider that's associated with their internet service provider. And that's providing address resolution and probably nothing else, especially in terms of security or filtering or that sort of thing. And here again, there are some free DNS services out there that some people choose to use. The one that I've been most impressed by over the last couple of years is one called DNS Filter. It is not a free DNS service, but it is one that is relatively inexpensive. And again, they're not paying me to promote them, but dnsfilter.com is their website. And I would encourage any MSP or break fix shop to check them out as an additional layer of protection for their clients and for their own use. And also, let me just mention that because it's been overlooked some. A lot of the people on this webinar are in fact MSPs. They are providing services for their clients. And as most of you know, MSPs have become very frequent targets of ransomware over the last year or two. And in turn, their clients, their users get infected and or encrypted. And in fact, going a step further, what some of the ransomware is doing these days is actually contacting those encrypted end users and demanding ransom payments. So it's really gotten nasty with ransomware, even more so than it was in the early years of it. Long answer, simple question.
That's a great answer. It can be a challenge sometimes to think about all the different layers that we can provide to help those folks that need that from home, and which is a kind of a new environment for working for many people.
Yep.
I've got a comment from Dean, says training by Ken is lasting and priceless. And
thank you, Dean.
Yeah.
First took the workshop, I want to say 7 years ago. He actually came to Houston for it from Virginia. So, Dean, glad you're on the call.
And I think that catches us up so far.
Wow. Well, in that case, I've got some time, and let me just go ahead and expand a little bit on the issue of Rootkit. I mentioned, and I didn't mean to be vague about it. I just meant to honor everybody's time here. But as far as the symptoms of a rootkit, there are actually several different things I've seen over the years that are associated with a rootkit infection. One I frankly have not seen recently, but it was especially prevalent back in the days of Windows XP and Windows 7. And that was that you would be unable to manually install a Windows update. And of course, these days, that whole Windows Update process has changed a lot since then. I have not seen this as an issue with Windows 10 or even Windows 8, but I didn't see enough Windows 8 to make a judgment whether it was still a symptom there or not. But the point is, if you're having trouble installing a Windows Update manually, at least on the older operating systems, that was a pretty common indicator that there was a rootkit blocking it. Another symptom of a rootkit is when you download a file. The download would complete normally, but as soon as it did, from the system tray, a message would pop up saying the file you just downloaded had a virus and so it's been deleted. Now, every time I saw that, it was associated with a program like Malwarebytes or some other anti-malware or internet security type program. So I frankly don't know whether that same thing happened with any download or just with the ones that the particular rootkit didn't want you to have access to. But if you see that pop up, right after you've done a download, then that would be a symptom of a rootkit. Another symptom that, again, I haven't seen recently, but it was very common a long time ago, and then it took a break for a few years. It came back a few years ago, was a radio station starts playing out of the computer. Now, we all know you can go to a radio station's website and live stream or play now or whatever, but I'm talking about when you don't even have a browser open, but as soon as the computer starts up, it starts playing a radio station. And you can tell it's a radio station because it may be music, it may be news or commentary, it may be commercials, it may be in English, it may be some other language that you may or may not be able to recognize. But the point is, if a radio station starts playing out of the computer, that is a definite symptom of a rootkit. So those are three. There was actually a fourth that's slipping my mind right now, but that's what I mean by things that I would recognize as indicators that there is a rootkit present. So I'm glad I was able to add that additional detail, and so this will be in the recording, and we'll be able to pass that along to people that were not able to attend live.
Sure, perfect. Thank you, Ken. And just a side note from Jim indicated, I have seen this download issue recently in Chrome, yet I could download in Edge.
Ah, that's interesting. Now, a follow-up to that, was that the old version of Edge or the new version?
I wondered that too. I was getting ready to type that. New. Okay, it's the new version.
The new version?
Yeah, the new version.
Okay. Because generally, the new version of Edge behaves almost the same as Chrome. And so that's an interesting difference there. And I still haven't completely switched to the new version of Chrome, of Edge. I have used it a few times. I'm getting more familiar with it, but I've been using Chrome for a long time, and so it's hard to make the switch. But it's a step in the right direction. All right. Anything else, Roger?
I think that catches us up. Very professional. Well done, Dean says.
Well, I really appreciate all of you taking the time, and especially those of you that have completed the whole workshop, and you know just what I'm saying. It's a moving target. It continually changes, and especially Dean, in your case, it's well past time for you to come back for a refresher. And just one more note on that. Roger, being a level 2 certified malware removal specialist, is not the record holder. I actually have a level 5 and several level 4s. So the point is, the people that have been through this workshop come back on a regular basis. Now, more than once a year would probably be overkill, but I'd recommend repeating or updating, getting a refresher every year or two. Obviously, that may sound self-serving, but my main objective is to be sure you have the latest, most up-to-date, and most current, most useful information. So you all have my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me for anything I can do. And again, thank you for being here. Roger, thank you again for all you do and have done and continue to do. So you're a great asset. I really, really appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate that, Ken. And got a lot of folks saying enjoyed it. Thanks. Very useful in a short period of time. Great presentation. Appreciate your time. And so we got a lot of comments coming in for you in that regard. So well done, Ken.
Great. Well, again, thank you all. I've got my finger on the end webinar for everybody button. And so, Roger, I'll give you a few seconds to shout. Wait, got it. Okay, not hearing any. I'll wish you all a very safe, productive day, and we'll all get through this current situation, and we'll see what it looks like on the other side. Thanks again. We'll stay in touch. Bye now.